Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is the 19th night of Taraweeh, and tonight we are going to do three surahs: Surah Luqman, As-Sajda, and Al-Ahzab. Surahs 31, 32, and 33, respectively, of the Holy Quran. Uh, all these three surahs belong to the fourth group of Quranic surahs, which have eight Meccan surahs and one Madinan surah. The surahs that we are going to do today, Luqman and As-Sajda, they form a pair, and Surah Al-Ahzab is the one solitary unique surah, which is one of those six surahs which do not have a partner to pair with. Both Surah Luqman and Surah As-Sajda were revealed during the period of Itmam Hujjah, that is, the phase of the Prophet's mission when the evidence of the Almighty's message, the truthfulness of it, was delivered convincingly. And that was the time when people were urged to believe because they were informed that they had no excuse whatsoever to reject the message. The only difference that we find in these two surahs is that while in Surah Luqman we see a clarification of the practical guidance of human nature, which has been given through the advice given by sage Luqman to his son. In Surah As-Sajda, what we find is that the Almighty is responding to certain questions and clarifying certain aspects of the understanding of wisdom. So we start with Surah Luqman. Alif Lam Mim. This is Surah Alif Lam Mim. As I mentioned at the beginning of the last presentation, that these four surahs, Surah Al-Ankabut, Surah Rum, which we did yesterday, and Surah Luqman and Surah Sajda that we are doing tonight, they are all beginning with Alif Lam Mim, Huruf Muqatta'at, like is the case with Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Imran. Tilka ayatul kitab al-hakim. These are the verses of the book of wisdom. Hudam wa rahmatul lil muhsinin. This is a book of guidance and is a source of mercy lil muhsinin, for all those people who seek excellence in morality and spirituality. Allazina yuqimuna as-salat. The people who establish regular prayers. Wa yu'tuna az-zakat. They give zakat. Wa hum bil akhirati hum yuqinun. They are the ones who are convinced about the next life, the life hereafter. Ulaika ala hudam min rabbihim. These are the people who are on the path of guidance from their Lord. Ulaika humul muflihun. And these are the ones who are going to succeed. Verse 6 of this surah mentions the fact that وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ. From amongst men there are some who engage in distracting activities. People who didn't want the Quranic message to flourish because of their own vested interests. They tried different ways to cause harm to the message and for it not to get popular amongst people. And one of the tricks, ploys that were undertaken, attempted by some people was that they would bring in dancing girls, they would bring in people with music and would ask those who were taking interest in the Quran to, instead of reading, listening to and taking seriously the book, they should engage themselves in the more exciting activities like what they were offering. So the Almighty said that فَبَشِّرْهُمْ بِعَذَابٍ. These are the people who they try to distract people from the book of God and the way of God, بغير علم, without any understanding, proper knowledge, وَيَتَّخِذَهَا هُزُوًا, and they make fun of it. أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ, they are the ones who are going to get humiliating punishment. Then we move on to the main theme of this surah, verses 12 to 15, wherein we find that Luqman the sage, whose wise words were well known in the Arab world, in the poetry, the oratory of the Arabs, this advice that is mentioned in the Quran is what he gave to his son, probably at the time when he was being given the charge as the leader of the tribe. The Quran says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةَ أَنِشْكُرْ لِلَّهِ. We gave Luqman wisdom, and the first requirement of wisdom was that be thankful to God. وَمَنْ يَشْكُرْ فَإِنَّمَا يَشْكُرُ لِنَفْسِهِ. And whoever is grateful for his own good. وَمَنْ كَفَرَ, and the one who is ungrateful, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ حَمِيدٌ, he should know that he cannot harm God at all, for God is free from all needs, and he is the one who is being praised anyways. وَإِذْ قَالَ لُقْمَانُ لِابْنِهِ وَهُوَ يَعِظُهُ. The Quran says, and recall the time when Luqman was giving advice to his son, and he told him, Ya bunayya la tushrik billah. O my son, do not engage in polytheism, do not ascribe partners with God. Inna shirka la zulmun azim. Shirk, polytheism, is a great injustice. Injustice is actually depriving somebody from his due right. So if a person is deprived of what is due for him, what you're doing is injustice. The most significant right of this entire existence is the right of the Almighty to be acknowledged and to be worshipped as one and the only God, creator, deity, the creator and the sustainer. And if there are people who, apart from God, attribute to him some partners without any reason, evidence, without any intellectual argument, they are doing injustice, the greatest injustice of all. So, sage Luqman told his son that do not engage in polytheism, shirk, inna shirka la zulmun azim. Thereafter, what we find mentioned in the Quran is that the Almighty is talking about the rights of parents, which Luqman did not mention. Probably after mentioning the right of the Almighty, he did not want to mention his own right. So the Almighty inserts this passage and says, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ. We gave this advice to humans regarding their parents. حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ وَهْنًا عَلَى وَهْنٍ. His mother bore him with weakness upon weakness, and his suckling took 2 years. So we said to humans that we advised humans in their nature, anishkurli wali walidai, that be good to your parents too, and do not forget that you have to return to me. But if they force you to consider someone as my partner, for which you have no evidence, don't accept what they say. However, treat them well in the path of those who are inclined towards me. You have to ultimately return to me, then I'll tell you what you used to do. This advice continues, and from verse 16 we read, the Almighty says that Luqman said to his son, Ya bunayya, O my son, إِنَّهَا إِن تَكُ مِثْقَالَ حَبَّةٍ. My son, you know what? If there is a deed as insignificant as a grain of a mustard seed, whether it's done in a deserted valley or for that matter anywhere else in the heavens or the earth, God is going to bring it out for accountability. Indeed, God is all perceptive, all aware. Ya bunayya aqimis salata wa'mur bil ma'rufi wanha anil munkar. My son, establish regular prayer, enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and bear patiently what befalls on you as a consequence. For sure, this approach requires courage. Then we move on to the next surah. This is Surah As-Sajda, Surah number 32. It begins with Alif Lam Mim Tanzilul Kitabi La Raiba Fihi Mir Rabbil Alameen. This is Surah Alif Lam Mim. The revelation of the book is from God, the Lord of the entire humanity. There is no doubt about it. We find a similar mention at the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, wherein we have Alif Lam Mim Zalikal Kitabu La Raiba Fi. This is Surah Alif Lam Mim. There is no doubt about the fact that this is the book from God. However, the kind of expression, the style of presentation that has been adopted in Surah Al-Baqarah had given some people a reason to feel that the translation of the verse was different from what it actually is. So the Quran, true to its promise that it continues to clarify its own meanings, its own presentation in other passages, what we find is that this mention in verse 1 and 2 of Surah Sajda is clarifying what was mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, and it says most clearly that Tanzilul Kitab, the revelation of the book, La Raiba Fi, there is no doubt about it, Mir Rabbil Alameen, is from the Lord of the humans. Verse 7 to 9 in Surah As-Sajda is a very important subject. The Almighty says, and He describes the way we humans came about, the long history of the evolutionary process that was followed has been described miraculously in very few words. But obviously, if these words are read properly, you get an understanding that humans went through a very long journey of process of evolution before they reached the stage that we are now in. The Quran says, Allazi ahsana kulla shay'in khalaqa. God is the one who perfected everything He created. وَبَدَعَ خَلْقَ الْإِنسَانِ مِنْ طِينٍ. And He began the process of creation of man with clay. So that's where it all started from. There was this clay, mud, which caused humans to emerge from it, and it happened over a long period of time. We cannot put the exact dates when it started, when it stopped. That's for human investigation to find out. But the Almighty here mentions the fact that it started from there. ثُمَّ جَعَلَ نَسْلَهُ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِّن مَّاءٍ مَّهِينٍ. Then He continued His race with the process that was that required that humans would have the fluid which is of such nature that is it's an extract of a despicable fluid that was used for the purpose. In other words, after having required the pre-humans, so to say, to emerge from dust, clay, mud. There came a stage when the Almighty decided that the procreation process has now got to be shifted to the manner it happens now. ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ. Then He perfected him. That is, the nature, the physical nature of humans, the way they appear, it continuously, gradually, they became better and better. Then, وَنُفِخَ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِهِ. Then He breathed into him His spirit. At some point in time, when humans were progressing physically, so to say, the Almighty picked a couple, Adam and Eve, and He breathed His spirit into them. وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ, and gave you ears to listen, eyes to see, and mind to hear. قَلِيلًا مَا تَشَكَّرُونَ, قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ, and very little it is that you are grateful, you are thankful. Then we move on to verses 16 and 17, wherein the Almighty is informing us that those people who believe in the message of God, who take His signs, His verses seriously, they are the ones who get so strongly influenced by the effect of God's message that تَتَجَافَى جُنُوبُهُمْ عَنِ الْمَضَاجِعِ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ خَوْفًا وَطَمَعًا وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. Their sides stay away from their beds for some part of the night, calling upon their Lord both in fear and expectation, and they spend from what we have provided them with, and no one can imagine what means of happiness have been kept hidden from them as joys for their eyes to reward them for what they did. That is, while on the one hand they pray to the Almighty in this life and sacrifice their sleep for the purpose and get up early in the morning and seek God's pleasure, His forgiveness, in return the Almighty has arranged for their success, a life of comfort, pleasure, contentment, which is what you cannot even imagine while living in this world. Verses 23 and 24 tell us that there is a brief reference of Musa alayhi salam, is to emphasize the truthfulness of the claim of the next life. It says, and we gave Moses too a book and punished his rejectors too, so don't be in any doubt about meeting that day. And we made the book a source of guidance for the children of Israel. وَجَعَلْنَا مِنْهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا. And we made leaders among them who guided people, لَمَّا صَبَرُوا, when they persevered on the right path and truly believed in our message. So the idea is that if these people who were receiving the message from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if they were also to look forward to becoming leaders of this world by the mercy, guidance of the Almighty, they too had to persevere and be patiently waiting for the Almighty's decisions. We then move on to Surah Al-Ahzal, which is the 33rd surah. It's a unique surah in that it doesn't have a partner to pair with, and it's the only Madanan surah of this fourth group of surahs. In this surah as well, we find that there is good news given to believers, and there is stern warning given to those who had rejected the faith. And in particular, it talks about the rights and the obligations of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. This entire group we've seen is, in actual fact, an affirmation of the claim of the Prophet that he was from God. This group talks about this subject, but this subject comes to its climax in Surah Al-Ahzab. Verses 1 to 3 say, Ya ayyuhan nabi ittaqillah wa la tutil kafirin wal munafiqeen. O Prophet, fear God, be God conscious, and don't pay heed to what these disbelievers and hypocrites are saying. Inna Allah kana aliman hakima. Indeed, God is knowledgeable and wise. Follow what is being revealed to you from your Lord. God is fully aware of what you do. وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ, and trust God. وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ وَكِيلًا, and God is sufficient as a guardian. Surah Al-Ahzab is the surah of the battle of Ahzab. Like we have seen, Surah Al-Imran is a surah of the battle of Uhud, and Surah Al-Anfal is the surah of the battle of Badr. So in Surah Al-Ahzab, apart from other topics, what we find is that the battle of Ahzab is also talked about. The Quran says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu zkuru ni'matallahi alaykum. Believers, recall the favor on you when is ja'atkum junudun, when you had forces who came upon you to attack you, and we let loose upon them a storm and forces you could not see. That is, there were angels that also came to help you, but you could not see them. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرًا. Be sure that God keeps watching what you do. And recall when they came upon you from above and from below you, and your eyes rolled in fear, and your hearts leapt up to the throats with terror, and when you were having all kinds of vain thoughts in your mind. That is when the believers were tested and they were severely shaken. وَزُلْزِلُوا زِلْزَالًا شَدِيدًا. They were severely shaken. When hypocrites and those who had sickness in their hearts were saying, مَا وَعَدَنَا اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ إِلَّا غُرُورًا. God and His messenger didn't promise anything except what was a deception. So as the difficult times came to them, the hypocrites gave in because they did not have faith in their hearts. They were exposed and they started grumbling, they started complaining. Verses 21 to 22 say, at that time the Quran presented the glorious example of the Prophet. That is, when all this was happening in the battle of Ahzab, and there were difficulties and there was this pressure of forces coming from at least 3 different sides, directions, and the Muslims were under severe pressure. The Almighty at that time gave the example of the Prophet, the way he was behaving, to be emulated. So the Quran says in this famous verse 21 of Surah Al-Ahzab, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. There was a glorious example of determination, courage for you believers on that occasion. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَةِ. For those who look forward to meeting God and to see the judgment day. وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. And those who remember God unceasingly. In other words, the Quran is saying that if there were people who turned out to be hypocrites and the difficulty of the situation caused them to start complaining and therefore exposing their lack of faith, it's because they did not look forward to meeting God, they were not looking forward to the life hereafter, and they were not remembering God properly, unceasingly. And when the believers saw the allied forces approaching, they said, Haza ma wa'adana Allahu wa rasuluhu. This is what God and His messenger promised. Was sadaqallahu wa rasuluhu. And God and His messenger told us what was truth. وَمَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا إِيمَانًا وَتَسْلِيمًا. And this statement only added to their faith and submission. So there was this simultaneous contrast between the hypocrites and the believers. And that's what happens when trial, difficulty, test approaches people. Their real inner self comes out. If people are sincere, their sincerity is there for people to witness. And if people are insincere, then hypocrisy is also exposed. The hypocrites and Jews devised a strategy to malign the family of the Prophet and targeted his wives. So we find in verses 28 and 29, God Almighty, in response to it, asked his wives to make a choice. Either they would leave him without taking any blame. They were given this choice that the times ahead are going to be tough and they'll have to follow a very strict discipline. So if they want to leave, they have a choice to go and they're not going to be blamed. But if they would want to stay with him, then there will be greater restrictions imposed on them that are expected from than what is expected from other believing women. The Almighty says, Ya ayyuhan nabi qul li azwajika in kuntunna turidna al-hayata ad-dunya wa zinataha fata'alayna umatti'kunna wa usarrihkunna sarahan jamila. O Prophet, say to your wives, if you desire the worldly life and its embellishment, then come, I will arrange provisions for you and release you graciously. However, if you are seeking God and His Messenger and the home of the next life, then indeed God has prepared a tremendous reward for the virtuous among you. And the fact of the matter is that all wives of the Prophet, they opted to stay on. After mentioning, this is now verse 33 that I'm talking about, after mentioning the extra restrictions that were imposed on the wives of the Prophet because of the difficulty of the situation, the Quran says, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا. God intends only to cleanse of any impurity within you and to purify you to the utmost. That's what the purpose was, that there were people, hypocrites, Jews, who were targeting the family of the Prophet, and the Almighty therefore wanted them to be cleansed from all the blame that was being attempted to be hurled at them. Verse 40 is the famous verse wherein the Almighty is saying, مَا كَانَ مُحَمَّدٌ أَبَا أَحَدٍ مِّن رِجَالِكُمْ. Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, وَلَكِنْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Instead, he is the messenger of God, وَخَاتَمَ النَّبِيِّينَ, and the seal of the prophets. It's a seal which closes the entire system. So there was a process of prophets coming to this world, but then this arrangement of the Almighty had to come to a culmination, come to an end. And there was a seal that was to be embossed, which is what the Prophet, may Allah's mercy be on him, was. It's like the Quran tells us that at times there are people who experience a decision from the Almighty which causes their hearts to be sealed. Khatam Allahu ala qulubihim. That is, when a heart is sealed, then nothing can enter in the form of guidance. So the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was Khatam al-Nabiyyin. It doesn't say that he was Khatam al-Rusul, because all Rasul are prophets, but not all prophets are Rasul. Therefore, if Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was God's prophet as well as Rasul, and he was the last of the prophets, then that in itself also meant that he was also the last of the Rasuls as well. From there, we move on to verses 60 and 62. The Quran tells us that the hypocrites were indulged in all kinds of negative activities which they were doing so as to cause harm to the Muslim society and so as not to allow the message of the Almighty to progress, to influence people. And the Almighty took very strong measures to make sure that this negative attempt, the negative design of the hypocrites is frustrated. So the Almighty says that if the hypocrites and those in whose hearts is disease and those who spread rumors in Medina do not desist from what they are doing, we will incite you, O believers, against them, then they will find it impossible to live in your city anymore. That is, we have allowed them to continue to stay. We have been watching their negative activities and we have not taken any strict, stern action. But that's over. Now we are not going to tolerate it anymore because they have gone too far. And like the polytheists, mushrik, and like the people of the book, Ahl Kitab, these hypocrites also belong to the category of kafirs, those who had rejected faith despite the fact that it had become absolutely clear to them. And therefore, like the other two categories, they too were eligible for being punished by the Almighty through either natural calamities or through the swords, hands of the companions of the Prophet. So it was this second possibility that the Almighty adopted in the case of the last messenger. And he has mentioned it that the hypocrites are now going to be taken to task. Their negative activities have gone too far. The Almighty says that we will incite you, O believers, against them, then they will find it not possible to live in your city anymore. Mal'uneen, they are cursed. Aynama thuqifu, wherever they will be found, ukhizu, they will be captured, wa quttilu taqtila, and killed mercilessly. And the Almighty goes on to say that this has been God's sunnah, God's policies, always, whenever He has sent a messenger, if he is opposed, rejected by people, then those people who reject his message, they are taken to task. It is in the same context that a verse earlier, in verse 59, the Almighty has asked the Prophet to tell his wives, his daughters, and the Muslim women to adopt extra measures to make sure then when they move out into open places, they have a garment, a cloak that covers them, their head, so that it becomes a symbol of Muslim women and they are not tortured by the hypocrites and the Jews. The background of this verse 59 was that when women would go early in the morning to respond to the call of nature, and they would go in groups, as used to be the case in the earlier days, the Jews and the hypocrites would go after them to tease them, to cause harm to them, to torture them. And when they would be asked as to why they are doing it, they would say that we were actually looking for our slave girls and we thought that they are the ones who we are looking for. And the Almighty then mentioned this as a requirement for Muslim women at that time, that whenever they are going to go out, They will have their heads covered with a cloak, with a garment. And this was to make sure that they are recognized and they are not teased, they are not tortured. So the Quran says, Ya ayyuhan nabi qul li azwajika wa banatika wa nisa'il mu'minin. Prophet, ask your wives, your daughters, and the ladies, Muslim ladies, yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihinna, that, excuse me, they should lower a certain piece of cloth, garment over their heads, cover their heads with it. Zalika adna in yorafna. This is going to ensure that they are going to be recognized that they are Muslim women, free Muslim women, and therefore they cannot be teased. Fala yuzain, so that they are not teased, they are not tortured. Finally, what we find towards the end of this surah is in verses 70 and 71, that the Almighty is requiring the believers to be straight in their approach. The Quran says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu taqullaha wa qulu qawlan sadida. Believers, be God conscious. Ittaqullah. Lead your life in a way that you have this overwhelming understanding feeling that God is watching what you're doing. God knows what your intentions are. So be careful in your behavior. Ittaqullah. Wa qulu qawlan sadida. And speak in a straightforward way. That is, don't bluff people. Don't say what is wrong, what is incorrect. Be absolutely straight. And if you're going to be God conscious, you'll be straight. The Almighty promises, Yuslih lakum a'malakum. As a consequence, He is going to set your deeds right. وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ. And He's going to forgive your sins. وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ. And whoever is going to be obedient to God and His Messenger, فَقَدْ فَازَ فَوْزًا عَظِيمًا. He is going to have tremendous success. Towards the end of the surah, the Almighty is telling us that He presented the trust, Inna aradna al-amanata ala samawati wal ardi wal jibal. The trust was presented to the heavens and the earth and the mountains. فَأَبَيْنَا أَن يَحْمِلْنَهَا. And they all refused to take that burden. فَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانُ. Instead, when it was presented to humans, they accepted it. إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Indeed, humans are unfair and they are emotional. So, humans, they accepted this trust of freedom, that they're going to get freedom from God, and then they're going to utilize it properly. And they did it. They took this challenge because they're unfair in the sense that they exaggerate their abilities, and they take challenges beyond their capacity, and they're emotional, jahula. So they have this passion to go for higher ideals, lofty goals. And this was one important goal that was presented to them, which they have taken as a challenge. The end result is going to be that the Almighty is going to punish those who are polytheists, He is going to punish those who are hypocrites, and He is going to reward those who are believing men and women, because this challenge was accepted by all humans, but some of them succeeded or ultimately shall succeed, and the others will fail, have been failing, and the end result is going to be that on the Day of Judgment, the Almighty is going to decide as to who was successful and who was a failure. May the Almighty enable us to understand His message properly and to follow it as best as we can.